Hello there, and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor Dupre. We just had a show yesterday, and it was so well received that we thought we'll add another one today on a special Thursday show. The topic today, sex and socialism, two very controversial topics. One will get you banned, the other one will get you unfriended in Second Life. And you guys can guess which which one does what. No, but seriously, we're going to be discussing this within very strict academic frameworks today, because our guest is Kristen Ghodsee, ethnographer, professor for Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, author of many books, and the one that we will be mainly talking about today is titled "Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism." Kristen is also the host of the AK-47 podcast. We will also ask her about what that is all about, all the violence. AK. Kristen, hello. How are you?
I'm pretty good and pretty delighted to be here.
And how does it feel in this avatar? I understand you do have a history in Second Life. It goes way back.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just explaining earlier that when the Icelandic volcano erupted in 2009, I was stranded in Brussels at a conference, and it was during the semester, and I had to teach classes, and I was teaching a book called Coming of Age in Second Life, and decided that since we were discussing that book that week, that I would make all my students create accounts, and so I held virtual classes. This was online education way before the pandemic forced us all to
Way
go to
before, I
remote.
know this drives every Second Life for crazy. How people go like, especially the Zuck from Facebook, going like, "Oh, the metaverse is here." Come on, are you kidding me? We've been in this metaverse thing for a very long time. Did the
Exactly.
students? How did the students like it? I'm just curious. Did they? Because I hear this often, and I've done so many projects with students, and it really depends how the teacher kind of offers the context and everything. But a lot of students are like, oh, this is really lame. We got really cool video games, but this is probably what my boomer professor thinks is cool or something like that.
I don't know. I think because they were reading Tom's book in 2009 and they had a little bit of context for what Second Life was and the sort of the history behind it and the experiences of it, it and because, I was literally stranded in Brussels because of this volcano basically shut down all, you know, transcontinental travel. So I think they were very tolerant and very willing
Mm-hmm.
to kind of cooperate. Some of them took to it. I was like lecturing and they were flying around and stuff. And
Yeah.
others just sort of sat there. So I think it really depended on how adventurous they were. But it was
Yeah.
a really good group of students. And again, as I said, because they had been reading about it, it was a really fun experience for them to actually see what the platform looked like live. And this classroom that I found, I'm quite sure it was the University of Hamburg. It was a beautiful space.
Yeah.
So for a first experience in Second Life, I think for them at least it was very pretty, you know?
And Ava says here in the chat, obviously depends if the lecturer actually enjoys it. And I would add, if the lecturer is willing to not be, letting go of the control a little bit, because you're mentioning flying, and a lot of teachers are, afraid they're losing control over the room. And I think if you are afraid of that, that maybe Second Life might not be the right environment. If you embrace a little playful interaction within this context, I think it can be really cool. And
Yeah, no, absolutely. And because I was sort of so desperate, to teach my classes somehow, because I had no idea when I was actually going to be able to get back to the United States. It was a pretty crazy situation if anybody remembers that. I was flexible and I said, look, let's just hang out in this virtual space. And since we're reading about it, it's pedagogically valuable just to be in that space, even if you're not necessarily listening to me. But I think it worked out. I think it worked out really well, partially because I was really open minded and partially because my students were really curious at that time.
okay, so now that with that out of the way, by the way, Tom Burstoff, of course, should be known to our audience.
Yes.
Teaches at the University California at Irvine, and He is still very much active here in Second Life with very, very cool projects. Now, um, let me look at my run sheet. Ah, yeah, here. This is an important question. Now, Kristen, is this a propaganda event where you will convert us all to become communists? I think this was a question that came in from a listener. I'm obliged to ask.
Yeah. No, obviously not. I mean, look, I have been doing research on women's rights in Eastern Europe historically, before, during, and after communism for the last 25 years. So everything that I write, everything that I, prepare or speak about is based on a very, very deep archive of ethnographic and historical research in archives in the field. And my look, my goal is not to convert or convince anybody of anything. My goal is always to educate. I am a professor, I am an ethnographer, and I really feel it's important for people to kind of try to overcome some of these terrible stereotypes that we still
Yeah.
have about Eastern Europe.
It is incredibly annoying, this incredibly childish, actually that's a disservice to say childish, because I think oftentimes children have a more nuanced way to look at things actually, than this equating. And you said earlier before we went on the air about universal pre-K, oh my god, that's a slippery slope from universal pre-K to the gulag, similar to gay rights to marrying a horse. I guess it's a similar thing in the American context, but I would also say I've heard these slippery slope arguments in Germany just as well. So it's not exclusive to the US.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, look, I think, I mean, obviously, because I'm American and I work in an American academy, I have to deal with the aftermath of McCarthyism and the aftermath of Reaganism, particularly Reaganism, I think.
Hmm.
And so there's a certain narrative about the experience of really existing state socialism in Eastern Europe, which justifies the neoliberal economy, the neoliberal economic policies that really sort of they started in Latin America in the 80s, but they basically get turbocharged after 1989, particularly in Eastern Europe. And then from Eastern Europe, they go all over the world. The dismantling of the welfare state, the cutting of social spending, these arguments for efficiency in order to, you know, boost economic output at the expense of ordinary people,
Yeah.
and the privileging of finance over the privileging of workers. Look, Tony Blair in labor in 1984, removed a clause in labor's internal bylaws, which basically called for worker ownership of the means of production. I think that was a really kind of watershed moment, because everybody, even people on the so-called left, in places like the UK, or certainly in Eastern Europe, but in the United States as well, they all kind of jumped on this neoliberal bandwagon. And I
I'm
think
actually
that, yeah, it's really important to kind of understand the
it,
historical processes that underpin that transformation.
it's actually really, I didn't want to interrupt, but it's so fast. I'm reading Rick Perlstein's Invisible Bridge, um, how the how the US transitioned from Nixon into Reaganism. Basically, it's so super fascinating. Especially there was all these protests against the Equal Rights Amendment, where a lot of women were propagandized to be active against their own interest. But I don't want to get too much into the weeds. This is such a vast, super fascinating topic, and you actually have in your book, I think, 5 pages of suggested reading. So it's
Mm.
really, really awesome. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It's, by the way, it's here on the table here. We have a nice sort of brutalist lampshade here, surrounded by the book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, and I think men too. But we'll talk about that. Um, Before we continue, can the camera cam out a little bit and show us a little bit of this magnificent set that was built by Ruby? It's a quasi brutalist gallery architecture here that we picked up from marketplace, but it fit very well, and it's decorated with a lot of imagery and posters that you, Kristen, sent over from various Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union, empowerment, women here doing stuff, working, being intellectuals. And if the camera zooms out, you see we're also on the corners were framed by the Tatlin Tower. What is the Tatlin Tower?
It is the monument to the Third International. It was never
Ah,
built, unfortunately, because it was, meant to be built in the Soviet Union after the revolution, but they did not have the steel necessary to build such a massive structure because
there you go. Because they can't really, their economy doesn't. But I'm sorry.
well, I mean, it was right after World War One and right after the revolution. So yeah, they didn't have much of an economy. But prior to 1917, they didn't have an economy, which is probably why they had the revolution in the first place. So, uh, but there are also some questions about whether the actual design for Tatlin's Tower is viable. I believe there's actually a group of people somewhere out there in the world that are trying to raise money privately to build a real to scale life
Hmm. Hmm.
Tatlin's Tower somewhere. But there's if you go to the Royal Academy, in the courtyard of the Royal Academy, they a small scale model of it. So it's an interesting kind of utopian. It was meant to compete with the Eiffel Tower.
Hmm. Hmm. It looks absolutely amazing. There's a lot of the architectural drawings you can find online, and we found this model on a database that shares free 3D models. Just want to say, because this is a educational program, the Third Internationale, the Communist International, the Comintern, was an organization founded in 1919, and this organization advocated world communism. So this is where this stems from. Now, your book. Oh, wait a minute. I have a wonderful slide to start off talking about your thesis in your book, because you are fantastically in the very on page one, I believe, basically turning away potential readers with the following quote: "If you don't give a whit about women's lives because you're a gynophobic right-wing internet troll, save your money and get back to your parents' basement right now. This isn't the book for you." Now, not every gynophobic right-wing internet troll lives in their parents' basement,
Of course.
so that's really an overgeneralization. But that's pretty much the only flaw in this book, I believe. um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, I think, look, as I'm sure I mentioned to you at some point, this book emerged out of a New York Times opinion piece that I wrote in August 2017, which unfortunately appeared in the New York Times on the same weekend as the Charlottesville incidents, where you had all these right wing guys in khaki shirts with torches marching, through the city saying, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us."
Mhm.
And then President Trump very famously said that there were good people on both sides. There was violence there, and a protester was actually killed. So I ended up being the target of an incredible amount of right wing vitriol
Mhm.
on the part of these, you know, gynophobic trolls, basically.
Mhm.
Um, and I think I started the book by trying to address what I felt was going to be, sort of round two of beat up on Kristen Ghodsee vitriol, because it was brutal. I had death threats and rape threats. People were very worried for my security. At the time I was not on social media. And
That's what
so
people often downplay. Sorry to jump in here, but you hear this. This cannot. We got to really emphasize this. And a lot of, I know, especially men, even sympathetic to this issue, will downplay it. But I think women, I mean, if you're starting getting death threats and people find out your home address and stuff like that, I mean, this really is not. It's not a joke anymore.
no, they'll swat you. I mean, they're really scary. And I was clueless because I wasn't on Twitter. And so I didn't see what was happening. But then suddenly I got an email from a friend that said, "Are you safe? Are
Hmm.
you okay? I'm worried about you." And I said, I had no idea what they were talking about. And then they started sending me screenshots from Twitter. And no, it was very, very frightening. So I think that I wrote. So actually, what happened is interesting. I got contacted by a journalist from.
We haven't even established actually the thesis. Basically, what you're saying here is
Right.
very simple. You're basically arguing that women in these former Eastern European states and the Soviet Union were in many ways better off on in their personal and sexual freedoms under these social governments because it was decoupled from the economic dependence on men. This is basically it's actually really incredibly uncontroversial, to be honest. Uh,
Exactly.
so and that's basically your main thesis, and then the New York Times piece come out and then you decided to write a book. So yeah, please go on.
Yeah, no, no. So I mean, so the thing that happened, I think that really that freaked me out and then made me write the book was I was on a radio show in Seattle. I think it was called Seattle Morning News. And the woman who was interviewing me, I ended up sort of chatting with her afterwards, or before. I think it was before. And we were sort of waiting for the thing to happen, the sound check and everything like that. Anyway, she said, look, she had done a story on Gamergate or, some
Hmm.
technology related thing because she's based in Seattle. And the online vitriol and the threats against her were so severe that the radio station had to provide her with private security 24 hours a day. And in this conversation that I had with her, she said, look, they are trying to shut us up. And if you choose to speak out, you do take this massive risk. But if you don't choose to speak out, if you stay silent, you let them win. And that really kind of made a big impression on me because at the time I was like, look, I'm an academic. I mean, I literally, the New York Times piece happened kind of weirdly by mistake. I had no idea it was going to go as viral as it ended up going. And so when I then got this call to develop the op ed into a book, my initial reaction was, hell no. Why would I want to deal with all these trolls again? I mean, like, it's quite disheartening to be just at the receiving end of an endless stream of hatred,
Hmm.
especially when it's very ad hominem hatred. But on the other hand, they were willing to work with me in the sense that they wouldn't let me change the title because the title, of course, of the original article the New York Times chose. For if anybody knows anything about journalism, especially op-eds, the author never chooses the title. It's often
Yes. Yep.
it's chosen by the newspaper. And then, so they wouldn't let me change the title. They really wanted the title to be the same. They let me change the past tense to the present tense, which I thought was good. But in exchange, I got almost 20 pages of endnotes. And the
Hmm.
reason I wrote the book, the reason I think it's so important is that everything I say in the book is substantiated with historical, sociological, or anthropological research. Nothing in the book that I say is without a footnote, an endnote to the source that it comes from.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the book is like, I think 200 pages long, and I think 20 pages of those, a tenth of the book is just sources. And I think it's really important. Look, I'm not just, you asked me at the beginning, am I propagandizing people? No, I'm just pointing people to the extant research that shows very clearly, as you said, it's
Hmm.
not rocket science, it's not that controversial, that when women have economic independence and they have social safety nets that allow them to better combine their work and family lives, they have better personal lives. And it's
Mm.
not just women, it's men too.
I want to read a few comments here. Berrigan says in the chat, I was taught in college that World War One discredited socialism because it demonstrated that socialism didn't unite workers internationally. Workers fought for their countries against workers from other countries. So there's some interesting books about that too. I mean, it's it's this explodes this whole huge subject, but that's a good point because there's a lot of very granular research done within the movement, within the various movements, how to deal with um, the revolution. And anyways, I got to stay on topic. Berrigan also says here later, Steve Bannon weaponized Gamergate boys and incels for Trump by revamping Breitbart to give them a platform. Yes, great stuff written about this too. And to what Kristen you were saying, this is a quote. And by the way, oh, let me bring back slide number one because our co-producer Shyla made wonderful slides with quotes from your book, and we used the cover. I think your book is translated into at least 12 languages. So we used covers from these various international editions. The first slide here is from the Spanish edition. Okay, I'm not going to pronounce it. And this is from the Indonesian edition. Here is a quote from George Bernard Shaw in 1928. Capitalism acts on women as a continual bribe to enter into sex relations for money, whether in or out of marriage. And against this bribe, there stands nothing beyond the traditional respectability which capitalism destroys by poverty. So, and then you write directly or indirectly, sex and money are always linked in women's lives, a remnant of our long history um, of oppression. So, yeah, there you go. We don't have to belabor this point that this is just a reality. You can deny it or you can look at it and try to find a solution to it or a betterment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think that, and as I argue in the book, this is not a new discussion, right? I mean,
Yeah.
August Bebel was talking
August, I
about
was
this,
just going to
yeah,
say. Mhm.
in 1878 when he published Woman and Socialism. Friedrich Engels has written about this in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. But we can even push it back further to people like Flora Tristan, who was a Peruvian French utopian socialist who was writing very explicitly about the relationship between women and workers, and that without women's emancipation, there could be no socialism, and without socialism, there could be no women's emancipation. So, this is not even necessarily an East European argument. It
Mhm.
found its instantiation in Eastern Europe because of the Russian Revolution, and then later because of the transformation of these East European countries after 1945. But to just quickly mention something about this earlier point about World War One, I think the discrediting of socialism is really a discrediting of Social Democratic Party of Germany, very specifically
Yes.
Social Democrats, right? I mean,
Yep.
there were people like Rosa Luxemburg, obviously, and Karl Liebknecht and Clara Zetkin and Lenin and Kollontai, who were very much opposed to the war. And they were very much opposed to the nationalism that ended up overcoming or superseding the internationalism of the socialist movement at the time. That's this definitive split between the Social Democrats and the socialists or the communists or the Spartacus League, whatever you want to call them. So
Hmm.
I do think, as you said, it's a very fine grained, very granular discussion to get into the historical weeds. But I think it's very important to recognize that there were very important figures like Clara Zetkin or Alexandra Kollontai or Rosa Luxemburg who
I
were
have all these slides.
absolutely, yeah,
Oh,
opposed to the war. Yeah.
we're going to look at all these slides because you have a lot of women in your book and only one man, and his name is August Bebel. But
Yes.
before we do that, let's read. We want to get a little feel for what the book is about. And you chose an excerpt with which is about your childhood friend Jake. This is a great excerpt. So please, if yes, please stand up, walk to the front of the stage without falling off the stage, which is good because we're level today. Sometimes guests fall off the stage, happens quite
Okay.
frequently.
And here we go. Yep. I'm
Slide
going
to the
there. Yep.
yes.
Yep. Nope.
Overshot a little bit.
Yeah, I think my keys are a little bit too sensitive.
Wait, wait, wait. Stand right there, and I will move the book
Okay.
stand to you. I'm a modern man.
Oh, there we
I
go.
can, I can do my own laundry, and I can hold the door open for women, and I can move the book
Okay, here we go.
stand.
All right. Is that okay? Am I facing in the
Yes,
right
yes, yes.
direction? All right.
Perfect.
So here we go. So this first section is it's the first couple of pages of chapter 2. The title is What to Expect When You're Expecting Exploitation on Motherhood.
And Jake, real quick, is a childhood friend. I mean, you get into it, and he's one of those guys who is, yeah, he's successful in the system.
Yeah.
He's the greed is good for our young friends here. Greed is good comes from a character that Michael Douglas played in a movie called Wall Street. We have a lot of we have a lot of millennials here in the audience. They might not know this movie. I'm
Okay.
joking. They probably know it. Who doesn't know this movie? Greed is good.
Read is good.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. One of my childhood friends, whom I will call Jake, hungered for financial success in a society where financial success reflected a kind of moral superiority. Jake valorized the idea of the American dream. He saw goodness in the kind of Horatio Alger, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, hard work required to make something of yourself. Back then, I was already a feminist with concerns about economic inequality, while Jake, true to the spirit of the 1980s, believed that whoever dies with the most toys wins. We spent hours debating the pros and cons of capitalism and the ways that Thatcherism and Reaganomics sucked or didn't suck. Jake embraced the Gordon Gekko zeitgeist of the age. Greed is good. I wasn't buying it. But back in those days, when domestic politics weren't so polarized, we managed to maintain our friendship throughout our college years. In the 1990s, while I was off teaching English and reading Karl Polanyi in Japan, Jake was hustling his way up the corporate ladder at a tech startup. One day in 1997, Jake informed me with great pleasure that he'd hired a promising young woman for a strategic position in his firm. She had been a finalist with 2 other men, and with my voice ringing in his ears, he decided to take a chance on her. They were all equally qualified on paper, he told me. But after years of listening to your feminist rants, I convinced my boss that since women face so many barriers in tech, she had actually worked harder to get where she was than the men in the pool. I was struggling through my first year of graduate school at the time, and Jake's news warmed my heart. I'd made a little difference in the world. Over the next few years, the woman proved herself clever, competent, and hardworking. Jake's company gave her a 3-month paid sabbatical for some additional training, grooming her for a promotion. Then she announced she was pregnant. The startup had no formal maternity leave policy, but Jake asked his boss to give her 12 paid weeks to stay home with her baby and make childcare arrangements. Jake argued that they had already invested so much money in her training that a 12-week leave would pay for itself in the long run. His boss reluctantly agreed. The woman returned to work after the birth of her baby and tried her best to keep up with the demands of a small startup. But she was nursing, and the baby kept her up at night. She would attend meetings bleary-eyed and unprepared. She called in sick when the nanny didn't show. She found a place in a good nursery, but if her son got sick, they sent him home. Her husband traveled for business, and she had no family in the area. Jake, always the optimist, believed things would improve once the child was older. He even offered to babysit in a pinch. His star employee managed to hold on for 6 months. Then she quit. That night, Jake called me to share the news. Dejected and frustrated, he told me, "I'm never hiring a woman again." "But she's just one woman," I said. "Not every woman is going to make her choice." "There's no way my boss will let me," he said. His voice was low. "And it's the baby thing. I can't be sure of anything about any employee, but I can be certain that a man won't have a baby." I think I hung up on him. But it really wasn't Jake's fault. What could he do in a system that provides no support for women when they become mothers, that forces women to choose between their careers and their families? Economists call this statistical discrimination. The basic idea is that since employers can't directly observe the productivity of individual workers, they can make observations about demographic characteristics that are correlated with worker productivity. They make decisions based on the averages. If women are more likely to quit than men for personal reasons, employers assume that any given woman is more likely to quit than a man. Economists observe that the theory of statistical discrimination can create a vicious cycle. If women are, or used to be, more likely to quit, they will be paid less. If they are paid less, they are more likely to quit. This vicious cycle provides a very good justification for government intervention.
Wonderful. This is Kristen Ghodsee here in the Second Life Book Club reading from Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And I threw up a slide here actually with a part of this excerpt here where Jake says, uh, it's the baby thing. I can't be sure of anything about any employee, but I can be certain that a man um, won't have a baby. And this is interesting because also later in the book you write about this. This is precisely something that some of these Eastern European states, and again, let's stress it, they're all different. We're nobody's denying that these were um, totalitarian regimes, Romania, etc., Eastern Germany, surveillance state, and so on and so forth. But they had these programs, and what I found fascinating. I want to bring up this quote. Let me see, where is it here? Yeah, the recalcitrant men were often standing in the way of cool ideas. It's interesting. Um, you're right. Specific state efforts to encourage men to be more active fathers. For example, when I became a father in California, I actually had a paternity leave, and I was actually a stay-at-home dad because my wife earned more money at the time. So I was like, hey, I'm going to quit my job. But anyways, here in Eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia in the 50s, um, it was encouraged that fathers were more active and participated in more housework. And then you write, however, in the face of male recalcitrance, governments focus their efforts instead on the socialization of housework and childcare, hoping to expand the network of communal kitchens and public laundries throughout the country, which is not bad. But it's funny that men were just in the East and the West are like, yeah, I'm not going to change any diapers. So that united us all, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, I spent a lot of time interviewing the president of the Bulgarian Women's Committee. She was the president of the Bulgarian Women's Committee for 22 years. And I have written an article with a former student of mine, Julia Mead, comparing efforts by the Czechoslovak Women's Committee and the Bulgarian Women's Committee really to get fathers to kind of step up and help out more around the house and help out more with childcare. And the truth of the matter is that, at least in the context of Eastern Europe, 40 years was not enough to overcome millennia of patriarchy.
Hmm.
And so all of these state socialist countries, both for practical reasons and for ideological reasons, because of course they were reading Babel and they were reading Engels and they were reading Kollontai and they were reading Tristan, believed that rather than getting men, like getting men to help out in the private sphere so that the job of raising the next generation of taxpayers and workers and consumers and soldiers or whatever would be a private endeavor. All of these socialist thinkers believed that since society as a whole benefits from having the next generation of children, the next generation of workers and taxpayers and consumers and so forth, citizens, that society should help pay for society should support families in the raising of this next generation. So every single one of these state socialist societies, and by the way, I do also mention that many of these same policies were implemented in Western European countries and in Scandinavian countries. They decided that to the ability, to the best of their ability, they should try to socialize this labor. So rather than just relying on men to quote unquote lean in at home,
Hmm.
They wanted society to step up and really take a more active role in the raising of the next generation, which, of course, has the benefit of lifting, of removing some of the burden of that labor from women's shoulders so that they then have more opportunities to participate in society outside of their role as mothers and caregivers.
Yeah, awesome. And again, I mean, just to disentangle or decouple the motivation here, how this benefits women is different from the motivation behind. So the motivation behind may be like, oh, we just need more workers. So there's it's not what is the word I'm looking for? Benevolent motivation or sort of altruism, like we want to do good by these people. So there are specific reasons for implementing those.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. Absolutely. No. I mean, I think that every single East European state and the Soviet Union after the First World War and the Revolution, in every single case, they faced a massive male labor shortage because of the war. They
mhm,
needed women's labor force participation to reconstruct their economies. By the way, during World War II in the United States, we had excellent childcare. We had cafeterias where women could go get meals and food to bring home. We had everything. And then, as soon as the war was over, the government shut everything down and put women back in the kitchen, as did Western Germany.
mhm.
In the
Especially
Eastern Europe,
Bavaria, they still do it
oh,
to this day.
oh, especially the Catholic parts of Germany, absolutely. But Western Germany more broadly, right? It was what was it like? Kinder Küche Kirche or whatever, like a church children kitchen.
Oh, right, right.
Yes,
That's the German version of guns. What's the American part with the
yeah,
guns and
yeah,
thing?
yeah. I mean,
Uh,
it's really insidious what they did, but the East European countries, they decided to invest in women's education and training, partially again for ideological reasons, because that's what the kind of texts of communism, Karl Marx and Engels and Bebel and these other people told them to do. Kollontai in specific, because Kollontai herself was the Commissar of Social Welfare in the Soviet Union immediately after the revolution. And so she implemented so many of these really progressive policies around the socialization of the creation of public canteens and cafeterias and mending cooperatives. And they were really trying to break apart the private sphere and socialize some of this labor in order to free up women to participate in the more formal economy because they needed women's labor. Now, I think the thing that I say in the book, and again, I do want to emphasize what you just said, which is look, I recognize that these were totalitarian, authoritarian. I don't like the word totalitarian because it's a very ideologically loaded word, but authoritarian societies.
mhm,
And there were real problems: the secret police and the travel restrictions and the consumer shortages, many of which those consumer shortages particularly hurt women. But despite all of those negatives, there were these very positive policies. Now, the rationale for those positive policies may have been self-serving to the male leaders of these states. And again, as I said, patriarchy persisted, sexism persisted. It's not as if somehow the abolition of private property destroyed patriarchy. It did not. But all of these opportunities that were given to women, women seized them. And
mhm,
women like Elena Lagodinova, who was the president of the Bulgarian Women's Committee for 22 years, who I mentioned earlier, or women like Clara Zetkin or Alexandra Kollontai or Inessa Armand in the Soviet Union, they took the opportunities, the windows that were made for them, and they really pushed forward an incredibly progressive women's agenda. So progressive that, I mean, it predated anything in the United States, something like by 5 decades in the Soviet Union's case, and certainly by at least 2.5 decades in the case of Eastern Europe.
mhm. In your book, you mentioned all these women, and actually, our co-producer Shyla, who couldn't be here today, maybe she is, I actually don't know, but she put slides together of all these women in your book. You have photos of these important women from all over the Eastern European sphere and the Soviet Union. Before each chapter, you mentioned Elena Lagadinova, so I'm going to bring up this slide here. It's really wonderful in the book that each chapter starts with these activist women. Elena Lagadinova, agronomist, genetic engineer, women's activist. You mentioned Clara Zetkin. You mentioned, of course, oh yeah, here it is, Alexandra Kollontai. But Clara Zetkin was a important politician in the interbellum period. Your favorite of these women, if I could guess, is either Alexandra Kollontai, who was Alexandra Kollontai?
Oh, Alexander Kollontai was amazing. So actually, the dress that I'm
We only
wearing,
have 20 minutes left in the show, Chris. I'm
I
just
know.
joking. We have as
Yeah.
long as you want.
I could talk about Kollontai until the cows come home. So everybody, like when you finish the show, Google her and listen to my podcast, AK-47, which stands for Thai
Mhm.
47, because it's 47 works from the uh, the works of life and works of Alexandra Kollontai. She was a very prominent uh, Russian revolutionary. She started out as a Menshevik, as a social democrat. She became a Bolshevik after World War I, precisely because she opposed the social democratic voting of war credits to these nationalist governments. And then, very briefly in the 20s, she kind of flirted very briefly with what we might call anarcho syndicalism, for which she was very severely punished, and she was banished to first Norway, where she was the third female ambassador in the history of the world. Obviously, the first Russian ambassador, a female ambassador anywhere. She served very briefly as the Russian Soviet ambassador to Mexico, and then she spent many, many years as the Soviet ambassador to Sweden. And for her work in negotiating a peace between the Soviet Union and Finland, she was actually twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She was an incredibly prolific writer, incredibly figure. And so I could talk about her, and I do talk about her at length on my podcast. So if you're interested about Kollontai, there's lots of material out there to engage with.
And actually, I have this slide as I prepare the show. If you go to the check out the podcast and you rate this podcast on Apple Podcasts, you will get a sticker. The stickers are displayed now on our overhead projector here.
Yeah, my
Um,
daughter designed those.
these are really cool. Look at those. Wow.
Stickers. Yeah, she did a great job, and they're like really nice, like matte quality stickers. I don't remember how we managed it, but my daughter is incredibly talented in this sphere, and I wanted to do something fun to kind of propagandize Kollontai, and that's what she came up with. So I'm really happy about that.
Ah, see, those are the capitalist aspects of the revolution.
Except for that, they're for free.
Ah, see? Oh, that's a slippery slope. What's next? The gulag?
The gulag.
So,
I know. All yeah, exactly, exactly.
uh,
Isn't it terrible? Like I give away free stickers, and before you know it, like we're giving away content for free, we're giving away books and music for
yeah,
free, we're giving away everything for free, and boom, we've got famines and purges and Stalin and the gulags.
and that's why New York City went bankrupt in 1973. No, that's not true. Read Rick Perlstein's excellent book, The Invisible Bridge. I just brought up a slide here. Rosa Luxemburg, another important woman, and also Valentina Tereshkova, I think
Yes,
is the first woman in space.
first
Yes.
woman in space, 1963. At the time that
Hmm.
she was launched, I think she orbited she spent something like 16 times, I don't remember what the exact number is, more time in orbit than any other astronaut at the time. Um,
Hmm.
and of course, if you Google, this is the most horrible thing. If you Google first woman in space, depending on where you are, Google will often tell you that it's Sally Ride, who didn't,
Huh?
the American who was on the Challenger, which is terrible because it's just
Oh my God.
absolutely patently false, you know. But this is the power of um, he who the
He who runs
victors,
Google.
yeah, he who runs good, but the victors write the history, right?
Yes.
So yeah.
Everybody Google this. Everybody in the Second Life audience, Google and post your results. I got the correct result, Valentina Tereshkova. I want to move on to something that completely fascinated me, and um, it goes back to the basement in some ways because you write in your book about a study that came out in 2004 that started a field of inquiry called sexual economics, I guess, and this is really interesting stuff that these researchers found out, but unfortunately, it is like many other things weaponized by right wingers. And so this is the quote from your book. So sexual economics, just really briefly, what does it say? What do they claim?
Very briefly, it's a very weird set of presumptions, but essentially they basically say that sexual economics theory is that women sell sex and men buy it. And in societies where women have
And that
no,
was in 2004, before dating apps.
yes, oh, well before dating apps, well
Mhm,
before dating apps. And I see you have the tie cover up on the
mhm.
screen right now, which is quite
That
interesting.
works great.
Yeah. So basically, the idea is that sexual economics theory proposes that in societies where women have very few economic opportunities outside of marriage, right? So they can't go to school, they can't get jobs. They're basically, their only hope in life is to marry well. The price of sex is extremely high because no woman is going to give her sex away unless the guy marries her.
Mhm,
But in societies where women have lots of opportunities outside of marriage, they can go to school, they can get educated, they can get jobs, they can get training, they can live independently. It's totally normal for women to live independently, to live with friends or whatever. Then the price of sex is very low. So it's a kind of marketization of sex. And what I talk about in the book is how these two authors, when they wrote this paper, I don't think they had any idea that they were essentially regurgitating Babel,
mhm,
right? Who wrote essentially exactly that in 1879. And Babel had all of this influence on Kollontai, who also wrote a lot about the way that capitalism commodifies women's bodies. And essentially, you have Baumeister and Vose are the two authors of this article in 2004. They basically admitted that in a capitalist society, if you want men to work hard, if you want men to be motivated in life, you need to increase the price of sex by limiting women's rights, which is
mhm,
exactly what Texas just did by banning abortion after 6 weeks, right, of pregnancy.
mhm,
So if women can't have access to contraception or women can't have access to abortion, then the price of sex becomes really high. That means men have to earn a lot of money in order to get a woman. And then somehow that makes men more productive. This is their rationale,
This is
obviously,
amazing.
not mine. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then the right wingers, for them, it's perfect because here, and this is the quote from your book, they take this and they go like, "Yeah, now we know why." And I'm reading why young people are camping out in their parents' basement playing video games and just eating Domino's pizza because cheap sex is just a text away. When
Exactly.
so it's that's what the problem is, that these
That's
independent
what the
women
right wing
make.
says. Yeah.
Yes, these independent women practically force people to stay in their mom's basement and eat pizza. uh, it's
Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, and then I also talk about this guy, Roosh, right? This pickup artist who wrote this
Oh yeah,
book,
don't
Don't Bang Denmark, right?
don't Google that, folks. Actually, maybe you should. Uh, oh my God. Actually, just before I contacted you, in another context, I heard about this guy, and that's just insane. So this guy, Woosh, went to Denmark. He's a pickup artist, and it didn't work out because women are too independent in Denmark.
Yeah, he basically says, he just said, like, because the state will pay for women to like live alone with their cats. He says something really derogatory. I can't remember exactly the language, but basically he says it's really, really hard to pick up women in Denmark because all of the tricks that he knows, which are basically about showing them shiny things and being negative on them, trying to, insult them and make them feel bad about themselves. Like, it doesn't work on Danish women because Danish women are too economically independent. So he has all these books like Bang Ukraine or whatever. I mean, this was some of the things that really got me upset, was that like lots of success in Eastern Europe, where women are so much poorer now after this transition to neoliberal capitalism. But Denmark is off limits because, look, those women there, they don't need men. And so for a humble, poor pickup artist like him, who's just looking to score with as many women as possible in the shortest amount of time, Denmark is like a desert, because you're never going to score there because women aren't interested in what the flashy, shiny things he has to offer.
Really entrepreneurial, this guy with his tourism business. How to travel the world when
I
your
mean, and
goal is to pick up women.
he has a huge. I mean, he had a huge following.
Yeah.
I actually think, to be
I mean, and
fair,
I don't want to make light of this. I actually think, I mean, this is another whole a big subject with, a lot of young men. I'm not saying anything new here. This has been studied and people have been warning about this. Gamergate didn't happen yesterday. There are a lot of young people who lack role models, and there are people preying on them in online forums, in games, everywhere, and it's really it's pretty dangerous, and I feel that sort of the mainstream middle class folks are still not comprehending how big this issue really is, how left alone these men are. And every once in a while there's a horrible shooting and there is some link
mm,
to the incel community, and then people go, oh, yeah, okay, that's one crazy guy that took the stuff offline that he got online. But other than that, it's no big deal. Anyways, I'm getting off a tangent here.
no,
Go ahead.
but this is a really good point, because I think that the classic right wing strategy is to look at what's happening in society, and rather than blame the economic system within which we're living that creates these conditions of isolation and creates
Mhm.
these conditions of precarity, it's so much easier to blame minorities, foreigners, or women. Like, that has always been a kind of classic right wing way of dealing with critiques of the economic system, of dealing with critiques of economic inequality, of dealing with critiques of exploitation, is to blame other people. And so I really feel is super important when we are talking about things like sexual economics theory, is precisely the fact that it has been weaponized by the right wing, that they're using this sort of frustration, they're subverting this frustration that people have, which the root cause of which is neoliberalism and capitalism and exploitation and precarity and isolation and the commodification of our emotions and the commodification of affect and the commodification of attention. And they're saying that it's all women's fault, or it's all the fault of the foreigners, or it's all the fault of the minorities, in the case of the United States, of the Black population. Blame somebody other than the system. And so I think
Mhm.
it's really important to keep that in mind, that this is not something new. This is something that has been happening over and over and over and over again years. And it's not a problem that's going away. And one of the things that I wrote this book
But you
during
know
the
what?
Trump
Sorry, jump in
administration.
here.
Yeah.
The reason why it's not going away, and actually I have it here on my run sheet. I said, Kristen, I only invited you so you can actually train me as like a life coach, because when I get into these debates out there, walking with the dog and talking to someone, I just sometimes fail to structure my argument. And you said this is going on. And one of the reasons why this is going on, though, I would say, and I don't have the answer to this, that the progressive left is oftentimes unable to formulate an argument that resonates with the larger population. I mean, obviously, it's much easier to blame poor people, immigrants, and so on and so forth. So the right has it easier. That's a given. But why is the left, or the progressive left, or whatever you want to call it, not able to formulate an argument that resonates with people that are disadvantaged?
Because ultimately, I mean, this is a really great question. And again,
And
I
I
feel like I
know
could.
one of the problems is, of course, the mainstream media and all this kind of stuff, manufacturing consent and so on and so forth. But let's just stipulate that they would give you a form, like here, for example, in Germany, we have the Bundestagswahl coming up,
Yep.
so everybody actually gets equal airtime. That's one good thing about Germany, that in the public television, every small party gets sort of equal airtime. So theoretically people can sort of make their own choice, but yeah, some of the people that I would like to see in office, they're not really great in making the case even when they get that airtime. So
Yeah, I do think that first of all, the left is held obviously often to higher moral standards than the right.
yeah.
If you slip up once, if you make some stupid, careless statement, it's so much harder to exist in the kind of media sphere that we exist in, where there's a lot of kind of moral purity required. The left often lets the perfect be the enemy of the good, which I think is has been a problem, by the way, for a really long time. If you look at the history of the First International and the Second International and all these divisions, it's all about different leftists arguing amongst themselves about what is the best way forward. However,
Mm.
is the key thing that everybody feels right now is that capitalism as an economic system has largely failed the vast majority of people. Capitalism as an economic system specifically depends very heavily on women's unpaid labor in the home. And we see this very clearly with the pandemic, because when the schools shut down, when when the hospitals are out of capacity, who are the people at home largely, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly taking care of the children, taking care of the elderly parents, and taking care of the sick or infirm? It's women who are staying home, again, largely because women's wages are less than men's. And so if somebody has to stay home, it makes economically rational sense that it's always going to be the person with the lower wage. I mean, as you said, in your case, your wage was lower, so it made sense to stay home. But we know that in the aggregate, to make less than men. And so when these care decisions have to be made, it generally is the woman who stays home. So capitalism, this system that prides itself on innovation and on entrepreneurship and on progressive competition, at its fundamental basis, it relies on the unpaid labor of people in the private sphere. That is not a system ultimately that is sustainable in the long run, because
Mm.
what happens when, right, as many of them are, to stop having children or to stop caring, right? Where does that work go? In fact, in the case of Britain right now, there's this big debate over this new social care tax for the elderly. And the question is, to tax the young in order to pay for the care of the old? Well, that's an interesting question, because if you don't do that somehow, if you don't find some way of redistributing resources so that you have social care, then it's going to be done by women's unpaid labor in the home. So the question is whether it should be a tax on workers, which is not very progressive, or whether maybe certain profit centers, like British Rail, for instance, or various enterprises that are profitable, shouldn't be somehow renationalized, and then money from those enterprises be paid into the budget to help pay for the services that are necessary to take care of the elderly population. I mean, these are real questions. And I think the problem with politicians, I'm following the German electoral politics, very closely, because I'm interested in what Scholz has to say, and the Greens and the possibility of this red green coalition. I mean, how do you convince people that the root of the problem is the economic system
Yeah,
and
that's
not
it.
foreigners? That's the
That's it.
key thing that you have to do.
But I think it's, yeah, exactly. And again, I'm putting you on the spot here to give us the magic thing that all the political consultants hired by the Greens and the left or whatever, trying to wreck their brains, working 20 hours in smoke-filled rooms, whatever. Uh, it's it sounds really easy to me. When I wake up, I go like, it should be extremely easy to convince everyone exactly what you said, that the economic system really is at the core of all these issues, and not the immigrants, and not poor people, and not maybe one person that the welfare queen, the
Right.
Reagan came up with this, and this is still a very popular thing. Like, oh, I know a guy who's working under the table. And, that's why we need to cut services for all, because one out of 50 million people is doing that. And he hurts me to the tune of €1 50,
Right.
while big, CEOs do all sorts of things and get bailed out. Anyways, uh, it's
But
something
we
that,
but we have
yeah,
this imagination that poor people are lazy. Rich people are completely lazy, but we don't think of them as lazy because we see
that only
glamorous
works with,
pictures
yeah,
of them on Instagram, right? Or Facebook or whatever. So, I mean, I'm not a political consultant and I'm not a politician. I have no interest whatsoever in being a politician, but I can tell you that when we think historically about the times that there has been real redistribution to working people, to honest people who are trying to get on with their lives and trying to have a decent standard of living for themselves and for their children, or for their communities, or for their larger kin networks, however those are defined. It's always been when there has been a real radical alternative to capitalism. And that is the key. For the last 40 years, since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there has been no real challenge, legitimate challenge to the hegemony of neoliberalism. And I think that when we think about progress that has happened in the past, and I can again point you to numerous historical, sociological, and anthropological studies that substantiate this, it is because ordinary people, regular people, citizens have come together, have found common cause, have linked arms across all sorts of difficult to navigate power and identity hierarchies. Those are important to recognize. But at the end of the day, Jody Dean says we have to find a way to link arms and be comrades and challenge the system so that there's a real threat to the hegemony of this neoliberal outlook. And only then does real change start to happen. And I think that that's where ordinary people have a really important role to play. And that was one of the reasons why I felt it was so important to write this book when I did during the Trump
yeah.
administration, to motivate people to get involved, to pay attention, not to be apathetic, not to check out, not to pretend that politics doesn't affect them. Because not only does it affect you in your public life, it affects you in your private life. It affects you in the bedroom as much as it affects you at the workplace.
Wonderfully said. And folks, do pick up this book. I just spoke to the producers here in the background. We have a vast team of producers. I think 15 or 20 are sitting there in my ear. And they said we can go over time, and we can basically take the post game time to stay on the air, because we have a lot of people viewing this also on the stream. What I love about this book also is that it ends on a positive note in a few ways. So first of all, here's a slide. Now I don't know if this is the Slovak title or if this is the Czech title.
Let me see. I'm
Uh,
trying to. Is it got a red flower?
Red flower.
That's Czech.
Czech. Okay.
Czech. Yeah.
Here you say, most importantly, reclaim your time. So this is basically your prescription once you realize that it's not you, stupid. uh,
Right.
you say, most importantly, reclaim your time, emotional energy, and self-worth from the reductive logic of capitalism. uh, and, you are not a commodity. Your depression and anxiety are not just chemical imbalances, and I would add the feeling of alienation. I mean, this is what Marx was talking about way back in the day. These feelings are not just chemical imbalances in your brain, but reasonable responses to a system that thrives on your dehumanization, and dehumanization in the sense of loss of feeling rooted in the community, the productivity madness. You also write in your book, you go into this whole, lean in myth that the Silicon Valley women like to propagate as well. That is, of course, also something that may work for a tiny little slice of sort of privileged women. But before we go to the next reading, what was I going to? Ah, yeah, here we mentioned August Bebel a lot. So here's a picture of August Bebel. August Bebel was the one of the founders of the Social Democratic Workers' Party, and then that morphed over time to the Social Democratic Party, which is today the SPD,
Yes, and and what's interesting
which
about
my
that.
family voted, but nobody votes them anymore because. But I don't want to get into the weeds.
But it's interesting because actually Bebel himself wanted to call it the Socialist Party of Germany,
Hmm.
but it
His
became.
political consultant said that's too abrasive.
Yes, they said it was, but also he had to make a compromise with the followers of Lassalle. So that was why it was called the Social Democratic Workers' Party. So it's interesting. There's a really great biography that just came out a couple years ago of Babel. And it talks a lot about these very nuanced debates about how the party got its name. But yeah, I mean, this is a book about women, but I felt it was absolutely essential to include Babel because he was really very important in these questions about whether or not, like, what the role of women in socialism would be. And he wrote this book actually while in jail during the period of the anti-socialist laws. So it's a very interesting story. He's an interesting figure. Again, I encourage everybody to Google him and do a little bit of background research. He's got some really interesting things to say.
Very cool. And I'm assuming you have in your reading list also in your book maybe the biography. There's tons of stuff in there, and also women and socialism was his book back in the day.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of things coming through here real quick. Lane was saying all governments, and I don't know the context, Lane. I don't want to miss quote you here, but you said all governments will eventually fail because somebody exploits it or something like that. And then Jessica has a really good point. But first, to Lane's point, I have a slide here from Kristen's book where it says the difference between governments and markets is that governments, or at least democratic governments, are ostensibly meant to serve the citizens. Okay, so that's the whole idea of one person, one vote. Markets, on the other hand, are always going to be rigged in favor of those who start the game with the biggest pile of cash. So this is more of a quote about the so-called free market. But if you, Kristen, if you were to look at what Lane said, oh yeah, Lane says systems will fail. So Lane, I guess, expresses a certain amount of cynicism um, against you, Kristen, who you're such a naive optimist that everything will be fine. And he says, don't even try because it'll fail. It's interesting because Lane is a great guy and he's also American. And I always thought the Americans are always like, we can do this. I mean, for me, as that appealed to me as a German, because the Germans are always nine, nine, nine. That's it. Equal to me. So anyway, um,
I mean,
cynicism, and actually in your book you
yeah,
write about this too.
yeah.
I don't want to simplify it, Lane, but it you know don't take this personally if I take you as the standard of cynicism, but let's broaden this because it's easy to be cynical, go like, yeah, let's not even try because it will fail anyways. How would you respond, Kristen?
I mean, look, I understand that there's a certain, and I'm very actually sympathetic often to the kind of Bakunin, Kropotkin, Goldman point of view, Proudhon point of view, that you have to tear the entire system down before you can build anything. That any state, and Engels to a certain extent also argues that any state exists partially to uphold the privileges and the contracts of private property. So yes, I'm very sympathetic to at least the theoretical intervention that systems, and by systems I'm assuming that that is a euphemism for states, some kind of form of government is going to always end in some kind of catastrophic failure. However, if a meteor hits the earth tomorrow, or if we have some kind of catastrophic climate event and we can actually start from scratch, then I would say, yes, let's try to do without any kind of massive systemic construct that's ultimately going to require all sorts of police enforcement, some kind of state violence in order to uphold. But given that we live in the world that we live in, even though I recognize that there are these inherent failures in these kind of state-based systems, I think we have to work with the situation that we have. And rather upholding the status quo by giving into the cynicism that any kind of reform or, Noam Chomsky beautifully calls it expanding the floor of the cage. He says, look, we're in the cage and we're all stuck here for now. But in the short run, in the long run, definitely the goal is to destroy the cage. But in the short run, we could expand the floor of the cage. And I think that what I want people to see is that rather than giving into apathy or cynicism or despair, and I would say that despair is actually the worst of the three, because I think the despairing of so many young people around climate change, and the despairing of so many young people around politics is really counterproductive. Hope is a valuable and potent political weapon. We need to embrace hope, radical hope. And I know that sounds like some kind of stupid Obama crap, but that's not what I'm talking about, right? I'm actually talking about like utopian, crazy, let's go asteroid mining. Let's put solar panels on like every highway in the United States or every highway in Germany, Autobahn in Germany.
Yeah.
Let's do everything, most extremely crazy thing we can do. Let's make every content like Wikipedia on the internet. Let's do everything. Let's expropriate Deutsche Wohnen in Berlin. Let's do everything, right? Like it's possible. It's possible if we agree collectively to do it. And the apathy, cynicism, and despair works in the favor of the capitalist. It works in the favor of upholding the status quo. So my argument is an argument not just for hope in this sort of flaccid Obama-esque way, but hope in a kind of crazy utopian Bogdanov, Kollontai, Plato, More, Campanella, all of these amazing utopian thinkers whose heritage is absolutely infused through our kind of cultures. And it's not just in Europe, right? You've got Nyerere in Tanzania or Freire in Brazil. You've got all of these utopian theorists all over the world who are constantly trying to force us to imagine not the way the world is, but the way the world should be. And as politically active citizens, we have to engage, and we have a duty and a kind of a purpose to imagine how we individually and collectively can make the world a better place.
I couldn't agree more. And I just realized with all these problems and with all this utopian, wonderful, this inspiring speech here, Kristen, I realized that I have total hope. But I also realized that my Steam Cyberpunk goggles that I wear in Second Life, I can't see them on the monitor. And that is, of course, a much bigger issue than climate change and the economic system. But we will deal with this in due time, because I'm looking here at the comments, and Greg here on YouTube says the entire thing is unsustainable and we're all about to catch exactly what we deserve. So he's a pessimist here, I guess. Turns out we're not really prepared to be a successful species on this incredible planet. Nature has a way of handling the unfit. Yeah, this is what you hear often. But I agree with you also, Kristen, because I also see really in young people and these movements, Friday for Futures and whatnot. There is a awareness, and also some of these leaders are incredibly eloquent. There are some people in Germany. God, I always forget her name. Uh, One of the German leaders of the climate movement. She's on TV all the time, and she's just unbelievable. She's just like some of these old politicians come on, they go like, "Yeah, look at that 19-year-old. She doesn't know what she's talking about," and then boom, so she destroys them, and that's good. So that's happening. Uh, let's see here. I'm looking through tons of great comments here. I'm looking at the clock. We do have about 15 minutes if we take the entire post game time. Um, yeah, let's just do it. Oh yeah, what you were actually saying also, and what Lane was saying, and I know Lane was talking more about adapting, but I would also argue, and I think you argue the same, that the destruction or the change of a system is really not bad. And you write in the book about a world map, and I brought it up now. It's from your
Mm,
website, uh,
yes.
the world map of empires, and you basically write that when you grew up in the 80s, it was like nothing's ever going to change, and then all of a sudden, boom, boom, boom. So this whole end of history baloney, and that neoliberal economic system is written in stone, and it's basically a physical uh, uh, law, is is baloney. Because if you look at the history of mankind, if you look at this map here, yes, these are long systems and empires, but they all went away and others came along. So
Yeah, I mean, I love this map. I teach this map. Like, this map is pedagogically for me one of the most important tools that I have. Because look, I mean, look at the Roman Empire. I mean, this map is really complicated. I don't want to go into all the details of how to read it, but the vertical axis is the land mass of how big or small the empire was, and the horizontal axis is how long it lasted. And I think the thing that's so interesting is if you look at the Roman Empire, which is this massive red splotch in the middle of this map. I mean, it's just huge, right? It like ended like on a specific day. Can you imagine if you were 20 or 15 or
mm,
30 when that happened, right? It would have been incomprehensible to you that this empire that had lasted so long, that had been spread out over so much of, at that time, what was the known world, would suddenly just cease to exist. So, what this map shows us beautifully, and I mean, this is like, for those of you, if you can find this image, find it on Google or whatever, get it if you can buy it. I don't know if for a while it was out of print. I think it may have been reissued. It is such a, when you're feeling,
I found it on a great website, KristenGodsee.com. I don't know if you
okay.
heard about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I took a picture of mine because I realized that it was out of print. And so many of my students asked me, where can I buy this map? Because I think when you're feeling like things can never change, when you're feeling despair, when you're feeling cynicism, when you're feeling frustration or apathy, this map, you can just stare at it. And I sometimes just stare at it for, an hour and just read all the little fine print here and there, and all these different civilizations. They rise, they grow, they fall.
Mm.
And if you, and I mean, as an American, what's really amazing at this map is that the USA exists as this tiny, tiny little purple rectangle in the lower right hand side of this map. So when you get caught up in like, oh my God, Trump politics, or oh my God, like what's happening, and all sorts of crazy stuff going on, or wherever you are in the world, you get a sense of perspective. And I think that often, because of social media, because of the news, because of the news cycle, we live in these hyper presentist moments because of the commodification of our attention, because of the commodification of our emotions. And so it's really useful to sort of step back occasionally and look at a map like this and say, wow, humanity has been around for a really long time.
Yep.
Every single bit of that map that has a color on it is populated by hundreds of thousands of ordinary human beings who fell in love, were born, grew up, fell in love, had children, maybe died, worked, mourned their relatives, you know, fell out with friends, ate, dreamed, looked up at the stars. It's a beautiful map of humanity and the potential of humanity to come together and do things. Now, I understand that, from an anarchist point of view, this is a map of like an oppressive state system of empires, of conquest. You can certainly read it in a very negative way. And I also have moments when I do that. I think about colonization and imperialism and the ways in which certain populations and certain civilizations have been much more aggressive and horrible to others. But at the end of the day, outside of the realm of high politics, this is a map of people. And okay, yeah, at some point, we're not going to be on this planet anymore. But we are here now, and we
Yeah.
shouldn't give up.
Yeah.
We still have
We should.
time. Yeah.
Well, we have time. We have about 9 minutes, and my virtual goggles have still not rezzed in Second Life, and that's really upsetting.
Uh-oh. So
I
you just
think
have big black holes for eyes
no,
then.
no, I have very nice eyes, but I usually hide them behind my goggles so that people don't really see what I'm thinking, like if I'm falling asleep when the guest is boring. So not today, obviously. But the other thing that I found, which is so awesome, you were actually, you know what? Let's do this reading first. Let's skip the reading from Red Hangover, which was planned. It's a fantastic book. It's here on the table, by the way. But please let's read this from the excerpt, the second excerpt with Ken, because I think that's important as well. Um, this is something that we talked about, but it also illustrates it um, with somebody that you knew, which is very interesting. Those, how people actually talk about what they want from women in relationships,
Okay. Yeah.
within that framework that we're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
we all know people like this. Um, I guess I was a little bit like that when I was 19, maybe for like a little bit, for a little while, I admit, but I grew up. Um,
All
but
right.
yeah,
So
so what are we hearing now?
all right. So this is the beginning of chapter 4, Capitalism Between the Sheets on Sex, part 1. And I chose this excerpt very deliberately because this was a very, very dear friend of mine, somebody very, very close to me who died on September 11th, 2001. He was in the North Tower of the World Trade Centers. And so I thought that since we're almost to this 20th anniversary of, the Trade Center coming down, that I would read this in his honor, even though it's not necessarily the most flattering picture of him, but it is an honest one. Okay. So my best buddy from college, whom I will call Ken, was an economics major who lost his life on September 11th, 2001 in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Over our 13-year friendship, we racked up long-distance phone bills and traversed continents and oceans to meet in person when a call wasn't enough. We convened in Hong Kong after his divorce. I listened as he sobbed over his vodka martini in a bar called Rick's Cafe. He took photos at my wedding in 1998, and on Labor Day weekend of 2001, he flew out to Berkeley to feel my belly while I was 7 months pregnant. He was gone before I gave birth. Born and raised outside of the United States, Ken lived the American dream, starting on Wall Street in 1989 and currency trading his way up into the company of millionaires. Before his marriage, he enjoyed the successful love life of a wealthy New York bachelor. At some gin joint in Oakland, we once traded notes about what people needed for a healthy romantic relationship. I still have the paper on which Ken wrote, quote, Christy say, physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. I say, nice legs with nice ankle, sad eyes, nicely shaped 34C boobs, and some brain, unquote. I had been trying to argue that there were 4 kinds of connections between people and that the best romances were those in which you bonded in each of the 4 ways. But Ken insisted that he liked his women pretty and just smart enough not to be stupid. Quote, I love bimbos, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, he wrote. But when his wife ditched him immediately after they earned their green cards and then bilked him for a massive lump sum alimony payment, Ken began to question his taste in women. I never wanted to date professional women, he told me on the phone after the sting of his divorce began to wear off and he felt ready to start dating again. They have too much going on in their lives, and they can't be there for you when you want them to be. I went out with a lawyer once, and all she did was talk about her cases. You talk about your work, I said. I know, he said, and I want my girlfriend to listen to me. Ken drew a breath on the other side of the receiver. But I think I should try dating more smart women. I'm tired of the gold diggers. Really, I said, that would be out of character. He went on to describe a recent epiphany. Ken explained that, as I suspected, he avoided intelligent and independent women because they made him feel less masculine, less in control of the relationship. But one of his coworkers had recently married a, quote, impossibly hot, unquote, corporate lawyer. At the wedding reception, after 5 too many glasses of wine, Ken watched the new couple dancing and decided that his coworker was actually manlier because he wasn't intimidated by being with a successful woman. Quote, I mean, think about it, Ken told me. It's easy to get hot chicks if you want them, but it's harder to get a hot and smart chick with her own money. And if she's got her own cash, she's not with you for yours. Unquote. He sighed. But I think they really loved each other. For Ken, attraction and love had always been tied to money and power. He used his wealth to attract women and reveled in the role of the alpha male. But Ken discovered, rather late in his short life, what Ken discovered, rather late in his short life, was the idea that more egalitarian relationships create fewer opportunities for emotional subterfuge and resentment between partners. Adored his ex-wife and assumed that she genuinely reciprocated his affections. She had certainly led him to believe so, ceding him all power in their short-lived marriage. After she dumped him for another man, Ken questioned whether his wife had ever loved him or had simply used him to immigrate to the United States. But what bothered him most was that he couldn't tell the difference. She had played the part of the attentive and loving wife right up to the moment she filed for divorce. He never doubted her authenticity, and he feared repeating the same mistake in his next relationship. Unfortunately, he never had the chance. He was only in his mid-30s when the World Trade Towers came down.
Thank you, Kristen. Another excerpt from your wonderful book. The book stand will disappear magically into the ground. This is apparently Soviet technology that was licensed by Linden Lab. Um, Again, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. We got to wrap in the next 3 minutes, so I got to be really quick. But I do want to say that, again, the book is wonderful, and if you do not buy it, you will not learn about the East German birth strike after 1998. You will also not learn about the 1954 Bulgarian industrial film "I Am a I am a woman tractor driver." Now, Kristen,
Yes.
I tried to locate this online, so I googled women tractor driver, and camera, please look at the slide. This came up. Uh, Oops, sorry, this is the wrong slide. This is actually a movie called Tractor Driver, 1939 Soviet movie. But when I googled "I'm a female tractor driver," scantily clad women in modern tractors came up. So there is a whole subgenre on YouTube, which is really incredibly ironic that this is also now completely commodified. Basically, women in super short skirts with makeup driving huge machines around. So I mean, some would
I
say
had
this
no
is
idea.
empower. I mean, some
Yeah.
would say this is empowering. But I mean, I would say it's not empowering because YouTube makes most of the money, and the people who post these, I don't know who came. I don't know what the split is of 50-50 between the model and the guy who owns the tractor, but I don't know.
Maybe she owns her own tractor. Maybe it's.
Yeah.
I have no, yes, but actually, this was a wonderful film that was made in the 50s by a Bulgarian woman director, Alsum Traktoriska, and it was literally about what socialism, the kinds of opportunities that socialism was giving to women at the time, and there talks about not only women tractor drivers, but obviously women pilots and women police and all sorts of professions that had previously really been reserved for men and suddenly were open to women. And I think that, look, there are lots of negative things that we can certainly say about these East European societies, and I do not in any way want to belittle the fact that there were these horrible things that happened in Eastern Europe. But I do think, and as I say at the end of the book, that there was a baby in the bathwater, as we say in English, that
Yep.
there were these incredibly valuable
Yeah.
policies, and that we should do our best. Look, we're facing all sorts of problems in the 21st century: climate change and automation and extreme inequality. These are things that the market cannot solve. And so we need to think about the experiences of previous regimes, previous experiments that really challenge the hegemony of capitalism, and get rid of all the bad things, salvage what we can from the good things, and do our best to forge a way collectively into a more just, sustainable, and equitable future.
Wonderfully said. Thank you so much, Kristen. And you got a bunch of books coming out too. If you folks here in World click on the book, it goes to Kristen's website. A book just out called Taking Stock of Shock, co-written with Mitchell Ornstein, and another one coming. So really amazing stuff. Thank you so much for this incredibly inspiring work. Um, I'm going to quit now with saying that we're back next week with the normal show on Wednesday, and next Wednesday will be extremely boring because we have a constitutional lawyer from India. No, it won't be boring because he's also a sci-fi author at the at night. Lawyer by day, sci-fi author at night. Gautam Bhatia, and he wrote a book called The Wall, which is absolutely amazing. And that's next Wednesday at the normal time, 12 o'clock Second Life time, right here on the Second Life Book Club. If I didn't get to your questions, please repost them. Maybe Kristen can stick around for a few more days, but we got to cut the stream. I will see you guys next week right here on Second Life Book Club Island.